Hello, I'm Clark Cooper, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council with the Atlantic Council's Middle East Initiative in the Scowcroft Center. And here today, we're going to be doing a program on cybersecurity and new horizons with the Abraham Accords. Throughout our program today, we're going to be not only looking at the risks and shared adversity addressed through cybersecurity, we're also going to delve further into the reciprocities, the benefits, and the opportunities and economic development with cybersecurity. So to start the discourse today, I'm joined with a very esteemed panel of colleagues joining from Washington as well as Abu Dhabi. And to introduce that panel, I'd like to first start off with our esteemed ambassador from Bahrain to the United States, His Excellency Sheikh Abdullah bin Rashid bin Abdullah Al Khalifa. And next to him is the ambassador from Israel, His Excellency Michael Herzog. And then to my right, Undersecretary Robert Silvers from the Department of Homeland Security with Public Policy and Plans. This discussion will be also available to our audience members. I ask that if you want to participate in our conversation to check the QR code. And for those of you who are joining us online, to check askac.org. You can submit questions there. So to get the conversation started, I did mention shared risk, and that is something that is certainly pernicious not only from state actors and non-state actors. So wanted to start with you, Undersecretary Silvers. It's no secret that the United States has been targeted in cyberspace. It's not just us, though. Our allies and our friends have been targeted as well. And that's a common shared adversity that I mentioned with the Accord countries. How would you describe those common cyber threats that the United States and other Abraham Accord signing states share, and how do we face that as well as the non-state actors and cyber criminals?
First of all, thank you, Clark, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for hosting this great event. Really happy to be here. So there are shared challenges that all of the Abraham Accords countries face when it comes to digital security. First, there are the challenges that affect literally every country, things like ransomware, for example, where you have cyber criminals around the world who are targeting whatever companies they can, trying to operationally disable them, and extorting as big a ransom as they can get to allow a company to get back to business. And we have set up a global alliance of countries called the Counter-Ransomware Initiative to counter that and work on that issue together. And that's something that we can work on really fruitfully as Abraham Accords countries as well as with others. In the region, of course, because the Abraham Accords has its roots as a regional initiative, there are common threats in the region. There are, from Iran, for example, we have seen cyber aggression directed across the region as well as into the United States, attacks on critical infrastructure, influence operations directed into other countries and the like. And so what we are doing here is we are seizing upon a geopolitical opening, a geopolitical watershed of the Abraham Accords, and saying we should take this development to digital security, to our cyber ecosystem, so that we can work together as partners to harden up our defenses for the next century of digital innovation and infrastructure.
So speaking of the region, and each of you, and I'm actually going to be going to Abu Dhabi, Dr. Mohammed first, so I'm just giving the warning on that, but this is for all of our Accord participants. So each of you face these hostile threats, and as Undersecretary Silver said, there's a particular state that is where that's derived from. But of course, there's also the non-state actors, those cyber criminals. So starting you with Dr. Mohammed Al-Kuwaiti, how will the expansion of the Abraham Accords into this space aid in protecting the United Arab Emirates, but also regionally, right? Because the UAE has always taken a regional approach. And as the head of cybersecurity for the UAE, I would like to start with you, and then we'll go along with the rest of the panel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Clark, and thank you for each of our esteemed members who actually, really, I'm glad to be joined with them. Would love to be there, hopefully sometimes, and physically be with them instead of virtually in that perspective. The ambitions that actually change into reality in this very clear across many of the digital transformations, not only on the points that Mr. Rob actually mentioned from an attacks perspective, but even from a business and pro-business perspective. Today, definitely, those attacks are number one priority that actually expand our defenses together. It is not only allowed us to share some of those informations that are used as proactively in order to detect and deter some of those attacks, but also have used and leveraged many of this information sharing technologies, policies, governance, procedures, and even people, power of the people who actually helped us in working together and putting many of those ecosystems into perspectives. Examples, as again mentioned previously, some of those ransomwares, for example, really preparing and knowing what are those IOCs, indicator of compromises that are actually being shared across all members in order to prepare of such attacks. And the deterrence by itself, as a matter of fact, the deterrence that allows us to actually note that we will not be attacked because others are with us. And this is what really brought a great momentum across many of the regions and infrastructures we have. Here in UAE, for example, we've been doing a great digital transformation across all domains, from aviation to education to oil and gas to many of those great critical infrastructures. Now, with all of this investment, it is a fragile environment. A simple attack could really cause a devastation here and there. But because of that relationship, because of many of this great sharing, allow everybody to really feel safe, feel really in a great momentum of sharing, as well as doing their businesses in a daily and continuously manner. So definitely it added value, definitely it added a great defensive measures actually across all of this. And the most important thing is it's really built a great cyber culture across all of those domains. And that's what we needed, as a matter of fact, a culture that allows everybody to feel safe. And this is exactly what we are actually really glad for such a Abrahamic Accord.
Thank you. Well, speaking of that culture, and as Dr. Mohammed Al-Kuwaiti mentioned, others are with us, and so others are here in the room. And want to hear a little bit more about those perspectives. He mentioned cross-domain protection, and so that certainly gets into every field well outside of the normal conventional security. So Ambassador Herzog, from Israel's perspective, I mean, how is that seen on how the Accords amplifying, protecting Israel's interests as well as regional ones?
So first, thank you for inviting me. Very delighted to be here, and especially delighted that with us we have the ambassadors of Bahrain and the UAE, my good friends and colleagues. To your question, as was noted, we live in the same region. We are targeted by the same actors, state actors, non-state actors, cyber criminals, and it's only natural that we'll cooperate in the field of cybersecurity. I mean, we have so much going between us in so many fields, dozens of agreements in both field of security and especially civilian areas. And it is only natural that we'll expand. Those actors who target us target our institutions, target our infrastructure. In a way, they target our way of life and cooperation. And we have to work together. All of us have long-standing, strong relations with the US. Now we have a new platform created by the Abraham Accords. So we should get together, and we'll be better if we do it together. It was mentioned by Rob, the counter-ransomware initiative. I think that's a very good example of what we can do together. This is a US-led global initiative. We have 37 nations on board. And in one of the working groups, we, the Abraham Accord countries, we are working together to develop a platform for sharing information and best practices in this field. The initial phase is done between Israel and the UAE. But we'll complete that platform together with Bahrain and Morocco, and then we'll share it with all 37 nations. I think that's an excellent example. I think we can do much more. We all remember the Iranian attack on Aramco. We, Israel, are being targeted in the field of cybersecurity by Iran every day. I assume our neighbors as well. So we have to work together. There's no other way, together with the United States.
Thank you. Ambassador Al-Khalifa, so from the Kingdom of Bahrain's perspective, obviously we've covered doing this together. We have to do it together. The threats are trans-regional. The opportunities are trans-regional. Their growth in the bilateral space as well. So curious to hear your perspective in that space.
Absolutely. Clark, first, it's good to see you again, and thank you to our friends at the Atlantic Council for hosting this important event. We've realized the importance of cyber. We've obviously seen how governments are limiting themselves if they don't embrace technology, if they don't embrace this sort of roadmap towards development. And over time, what has happened in our region is that we've seen more and more governments react to the importance of digitizing their services. And so as time goes by, we are going to see a region that is investing more and more in infrastructure, governments that are moving their services more and more towards virtual. And with that, there are a lot of advantages, but also a lot of challenges that come our way. And in your previous capacity, we used to talk about the importance of resiliency, the importance of working together towards building a system that protects nations in certain geographic locations. Now, what has happened here with cyber is that the old way of approaching challenges based on geographic locations have really shifted. Cyber knows no boundaries. Your enemies are at arm's length, and you need to work collectively towards building that resiliency. And so if we take an example of the US's presence in the region, the US Navy in Bahrain worked with multiple like-minded nations to form coalitions that are protecting the waterways that have a direct influence on global energy prices. I think it's about time that we do the same in the cyber realm, to work with like-minded nations to protect our national security interests through a multitude of initiatives. But the time is now. And I think that there is an appetite, and with the Abraham Accords, it has really opened up the opportunity to work together.
Yes, and I appreciate your emphasizing the trans-regional nature or the lack of containing a particular threat. And so speaking of resilience and the individual sovereign roadmaps, I'm going to take advantage of Undersecretary Silver's being here to walk through some pieces that may not be yet fully public. And so share with us, so how was the decision made on expansion of the Accords? Because as Ambassador Al-Khalifa said, the Accords really came in, was really rooted at more of a conventional space from a security cooperation standpoint. So here we are several years later, since 2020, 3 years later, now we're looking at a new space, one that doesn't know borders. Walk us through how did we get here to this day? And I apologize if I'm revealing something that's not yet to be revealed, but here we are. So
this is something we started thinking about during the transition,
right?
During the Biden transition team, starting in November of 2020. And the Abraham Accords had recently been announced and was obviously just such a beneficial development for the region, for the world, for peace. And so we were thinking, well, how can we leverage this? What else can we do to build on this? And it immediately became apparent that there might be an opportunity here. And we began discussions with our counterparts in Israel, Bahrain, the UAE, Morocco. And those discussions took place on the margins of various conferences and events around the world. We've met in various constellations in Singapore, Abu Dhabi, Tel Aviv, New York City, Washington, D.C., and elsewhere to see what the interest was and what could be done. And the answer from all of our countries was that the interest was strong and that there's a lot can be done for all the reasons that we've all said. And so this has really blossomed into something that is quite promising. When you have a geopolitical shift as tectonic, as significant as the Abraham Accords, you have to capitalize on that in every way that you can and build on that incredible foundation. And cybersecurity was just so ripe for that. There was a blog post by Tom Warwick of the Atlantic Council that said it was a surprise when it was announced, but in hindsight it seems so obvious. And I think we're all looking forward to see what we can do. And the partnership at the political level, but also at the operational level, has really deepened. And so the cyber leads in Israel, Gabby Portnoy, Salman from Bahrain, we've really been able to take the political momentum and will to seize on this and start building connectivity between our teams so that we can move at the speed of relevance, move at the speed of cyber in the face of these cyber and digital threats that really can move astonishingly fast.
And I appreciate Undersecretary Silver's bridging the political and the operational, because there's some practicalities that are required here. And speaking of practicalities, we're going to go to Abu Dhabi, and I had mentioned to Dr. Mohammed Al-Kuwaiti that I was very curious for him to share a little bit more about the Cyber Pulse Innovation Center. So this is something that stood up last year. It's a first, and it's at Abu Dhabi's own Polytechnic University. And that university, and he will tell us more about, that's part of that operational build for the next generation to manage all those cross-domain aspects that have already been cited here today. So Dr. Al-Kuwaiti, curious to hear more about this institution and how that's an investment on the operational side and how that's working so far.
So CyberPulse, as a matter of fact, if we go a little bit back, CyberPulse is an initiative to spread the culture of cybersecurity. And it's, as a matter of fact, has won almost 3 prizes so far. One under the ITU, International Telecommunication Union, in the United Nations, and another 2 prizes in ISC Squared, and another 3rd one in the Guinness Record, as a matter of fact. It is actually spreading the cyber culture across all domains, not only on the curriculums of the schools and as well as on the early ages of those schools, but also even on the board rooms, meaning the CXOs who are actually maybe not that much into cybersecurity. We try to really send that pulse towards everybody there. And one of those solidifying of such initiative is the Polytechnic Cyber Pulse Center of Excellence, where we jointly with the various actually entities have built that program or that physical, as a matter of fact, place where it is in the middle of the university. It spreads again and builds that synergy between academia, industries, as well as government, and allow that ecosystem to spread across the whole emirate and accordingly to the whole nation and worldwide, as a matter of fact. And it was a great success where we get a great ideas from our partner, Israel. They are known of that startup nations. They are known of many of cybersecurity companies and how they actually merge into really from those garage type of small 2 or 3 people working together in order to bring that product all the way to great companies we are using them on a daily basis, for example. And this is where it actually really flourished in spreading that knowledge into a synergical as well as into an ecosystem of that. It's spreading through another 3 Center of Excellences have been already actually established in Khalifa University as well as in Zayed University, working on that perspective and expanding that in many of the events. Mr. Rob as well mentioned about those events that we usually present our experience as well, our model of how to spread many of those aspects. Mr. Ambassador Michael as well, he mentioned about the information sharing platform, which is actually a part of that CyberPulse, where we leverage those IOCs, we leverage those information that we have in order to spread it to the whole community. It's so powerful when you do not keep that information for yourself. There are entities as well as businesses, governments, or even countries who are in real need of these information sharing data that we actually would love to spread it across as much as possible, because having that information, having that single IP address that the attacks comes from will definitely adds values to many of those entities. And that's what I actually working on that information sharing platform and leading, as a matter of fact, the CRI, the counter ransomware initiatives in information sharing group under the White House initiative in that perspective. So CyberPulse, and it was recognized, as a matter of fact, under the United Nations as one of the models for spreading information and spreading cybersecurity culture. Entities and countries, as a matter of fact, have been already approaching us to learn and use those lessons learned of how to build their center of excellence or their CyberPulse accordingly. And again, we have a very good learning model, accelerator program, as well as an enablement program allows them to just plug and play in many of those aspects. So that's CyberPulse in a nutshell, and would love if you have a time to come and visit and see some of those real changes that we have. Statistics, for example, if I just end up with that, cybercrimes have lowered, and here I'm talking about cybercrime against child abuse, for example, against some of the fraud or scams, against as well some of the elderly people who usually don't know how to use many of those electronics, and they get scammed using their OTPs or getting their basically stolen money here and there because of not really aware on many of those aspects. So definitely some of those statistics are really saying how it is becoming an important part for the society and for the whole world, and that's what we needed to actually reach out to the whole world, and that's our message to them and to the whole world from, again, Abrahamic Accord collisions that we are building.
Dr. Al-Kuwaiti, thank you very much for giving us a dive on the CyberPulse initiative there at the Polytechnic. That is fascinating. And your points about helping people, the society writ large. Seeing your ambassador here, Ambassador Yosef Al-Taiba, I have to call you out because I remember our conversations about being happily surprised at the people-to-people aspect. And this is what Dr. Al-Kuwaiti was talking about. This is society writ large, not just the militaries and the defense cooperation and the law enforcement cooperation. And so if one's looking at it from that aspect, I'm curious for those who are here from the Abraham Accord states. So we've talked about the threats in cyberspace and how that is not just from a conventional space, but also there's the economic activity, there's the social media activity, as just referenced here, and how there's some risk associated and corruption that could be addressed. So when you look at the high rate of social activities in all the Accord countries, and some Accord signing states have more mobile devices than people. This is something that matters, and this is why you do need something like a CyberPulse to actually get that efficacy and training out there. So I would like to hear and go around, how important in the high-tech sectors, right? So again, developing this next generation. But how is it built into economic development or planning for the future for the economies in your countries? And we'll start with Ambassador Al Khalifa.
No, absolutely. This is a critical component in the drive towards development. I mean, when you look at what a data breach costs today in the Middle East, it's about $6.5 million. That's 87% higher than the global average. And so these numbers have a direct effect on our performance. It has a direct effect on the global stage when we compare it to industries that have an impact, whether it's oil and gas or others. So one country can't do it alone. It's extremely important to look at ways in which we can pull in experts from the region to share ideas, to look at ways in which they can learn from one another, put mechanisms in place to ensure that we're sharing information, platforms are there, and that's the way forward. I mean, when you look at a company in Bahrain called Bion, that is classified according to Deloitte as the largest growing cybersecurity company in the region, they will be looking for partners. Yeah. And so this is where a platform like the Abraham Accords can come into place. But there are challenges as governments move more and more towards interconnectivity. When you look at healthcare, we're becoming more and more digital. When you look at educational services, all of these different sectors play an integral role in our societies, but we're depending more and more on technology. And so how do we protect ourselves internally, but also how do we protect ourselves in the entire region is what we need to think about.
Exactly, and when you're talking about those expansion in sectors, and we heard it from Abu Dhabi, Israel, the startup nation, and there's books about that. So, looking at that, Ambassador Herzog, from Israel's perspective, how does this factor into the state's economic development?
So high-tech in general and cybersecurity in particular are a critical element of our economy. They're a big engine driving us forward. And, you talk about Israel as a startup nation. We are increasingly becoming a scale-up nation, but I would say we are a cyber nation. And if you look, let's take 2021, the last year where we have data. In 2021, about 40% of global private investment in cybersecurity went to Israel, to the tune of $8.8 billion. In terms of our exports, that year, about 70% of our exports were in the field of cybersecurity to the tune of $11 billion. It tells us something. I believe that the potential is huge. It is good for our national security because it protects our institutions and our infrastructure, but it's also good for economic growth and economic cooperation. I think the potential is really huge, especially in our part of the world.
So on that potential, we're going to close with this. So the Abraham Accords provided a green light on the people-to-people, the business-to-business aspect of this. Undersecretary Silvers, can American businesses get in on this? Can they also benefit from this type of cooperation in the economic development space?
Oh, certainly. The MENA region is critical. It's a critical market. It's one where American companies already have a strong presence. And I think, this is clearly about cybersecurity, but it's not cybersecurity for its own sake. This is an economic initiative because all the countries represented in this event today are major oil and gas producers. Israel with its new offshore gas development, obviously Bahrain and the UAE, and of course the United States. So this is about protecting energy. What could be more critical to our economies than that? We all have major seaports, whether Jebel Ali in the United Arab Emirates, the Fifth Fleet based in Bahrain. And so what could be more important to our economies than protecting that? We all have airlines that are, in some cases, the lifeblood of what has made our societies vibrant and dynamic. So we all have these common fixtures of our economies, but you have to build an architecture of security around it. And what we are doing is, what we've collectively decided to do is to seize an opportunity to do that better together. And that's just going to create opportunities big and small across the board for all our countries, all our companies within our countries and beyond.
Excellent. And with that, thank you all for joining us today. And as the themes here we've got are greater opportunities, cross-domain. We heard about academia, healthcare, economic development, hydrodiplomacy, which is another aspect of the Abraham Accords as well. So with that, thank you very much. Our next portion, we are going to have members of Congress join us from the Abraham Accords Caucus, as well as the Cybersecurity Caucus. And this is where the rubber meets the road on implementation, on policy development from the U.S. side. Thank you for joining us for this portion. We look forward to having you participate with the remaining portions today following congressional remarks and the panel of experts. Again, go to askac.org. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm United States Senator James Langford from the great state of Oklahoma, and I wish I could have the opportunity to actually see you face to face today and talk about this important issue with you, to be able to hear other ideas and to be able to hear the dialogue. But I appreciate your engagement on the issue of cybersecurity. When we are more secure, when our allies are more secure, when we cooperate together on the basic issue of cybersecurity. It's not just a local issue, as this group knows extremely well. We need more people to be able to engage, to be able to share ideas, to be able to see what's actually happening, and to find and work towards common solutions. It's especially important in regions like the Middle East. I recently led a bipartisan delegation with Senator Jackie Rosen and several others, both Republicans and Democrats, to the Abraham Accords countries. That would be Morocco, Bahrain, UAE, and Israel. To be able to see the cooperation that they are doing economically, tourism, investment, energy, but now also cybersecurity. It's incredibly important in our nations, and it's incredibly important in the Middle East because they face a common threat of a very advanced cybersecurity threat from Iran. It's not just local actors and people just trying to be able to steal each other's numbers. It's also an issue of terrorist groups and state actors trying to be able to influence foreign policy. When nations cooperate together and share their insight, it helps everyone. So I'm grateful that the Abraham Accords has now expanded beyond just energy and water and innovation and education into areas of mutual cooperation like cybersecurity. Thanks for advancing this. It is important to our national security, and it's important to our continued cooperation towards a more peaceful world in the days ahead.
Morning, everybody. I'm Congresswoman Alyssa Slacken from Michigan. Sorry I couldn't be there in person to thank the Atlantic Council and 7 Initiative for giving me this opportunity to say a couple of words about the importance of cybersecurity in advancing our national security. For those who don't know me, I'm a national security person by training. Before I came to Congress, I started my career at the CIA. I did 3 tours in Iraq alongside the military. I was at the DNI's office. And then ultimately spent 7 years at the Pentagon, where I was responsible for defense policy sort of everywhere in the world but Asia. So all those countries in the Middle East that you all are talking about. I've been in Congress since 2018, and now I'm proud to be the co-chair of the Congressional Cybersecurity Caucus. The Cybersecurity Caucus is the primary forum for educating members and their staffs on cybersecurity policy and on the cybersecurity challenges that the United States faces. Caucus was founded in 2008, and it would be an understatement to say that the cyber landscape has fundamentally changed since then. Today, cyber threats affect our everyday lives, which is why this is such an important topic to talk about through the Abraham Accords. And I thought what would be useful is to give you a sampling of how this can really affect sort of people at the granular level so that they actually feel some of the progress and cooperation that's going on. We know that cybersecurity threats affect all different sectors: the economy, telecommunications, finance, information sharing, data storage, et cetera, et cetera. We also know that the advent of artificial intelligence is going to supercharge cyber threats here globally, so this is a really important topic. Opportunities and threats in the cyber realm know no national borders, no physical boundaries. That's what makes cyber and the interconnectedness that it creates such a powerful agent for growth and change, but also a dangerous vulnerability for individuals, for companies, for organizations, and certainly for governments. One point that I want to emphasize is the lack of norms around cyberspace and cyber attacks really makes this a complicated issue. And it's a place where I think the Abraham Accords can actually do some real positive, affirmative good, is helping to think through some of those norms, those standards that have right now kept us from having real doctrine on the issue of cybersecurity and cyber attacks. I'll give you an example of how this is affecting people at the local level, because I think it will be effective for people at the local level in the Middle East as well. When I met with my Michigan primary and secondary school superintendents last year here in DC, I asked them to raise their hands if they had ever been hit by a ransomware attack. Every single superintendent in my district raised their hands. I share that story to drive home how important international cooperation is in cybersecurity to ensuring the security of people on the ground, communities on the ground, way down to the local level, way more than a lot of policy issues that we deal with a lot of times in Washington. So it's a really good thing that most national security challenges don't have that day-to-day impact, but this one certainly does. So I'm encouraged to hear that the expanded scope of the Abraham Accords includes shared cybersecurity priorities and regional cooperation to address these shared threats. That includes criminal and state-sponsored targeting of critical infrastructure and ransomware attacks. So I really think that enhanced cyber cooperation can really lay the groundwork for deeper cooperation in other areas. Thank you all for being here. Thank you again to the Atlantic Council for having me, and thanks for working on a topic that I think has such amazing need and opportunity.
And thank you very much, Senators Langford and Representative Slacken, for your important remarks. My name is Tom Warwick. I'm a senior fellow and the director of the Future of DHS project here at the Atlantic Council. I was previously in the Department of Homeland Security as a Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Office of Policy. And it's really an honor to be joined here by three of the most prominent experts in the United States on cybersecurity policy and strategy. I did want to first acknowledge, though, the congressional support that the Abraham Accords have enjoyed, strong bipartisan support. And in particular, I wanted to recognize that Senator Jackie Rosen will be introducing a bill shortly after Memorial Day that will codify and support the roles that the Department of Homeland Security and its agencies and components will be able to do in the cyber domain, as Undersecretary Silvers has laid out. So wanted to recognize Daniel Bleberg of Senator Rosen's staff for their contributions to the shared multilateral security effort that the Abraham Accords represents and the expansion into the cyber domain. Just as a reminder to everyone, today's event is unclassified and on the record. We're going to be able to take your questions through the askac.org website. And for those here live, there's a QR code that you can scan. It will take you, because we are a cybersecurity conference today, it will take you to a website called stagetimer.io. And that will allow us to get your questions electronically, and I'll be able to ask a number of them from this podium today. Let me introduce my three distinguished guests. First, remotely, we have Jeanette Manfra, who is the Global Director for Security and Compliance at Google. Before that, she was an Assistant Director for Cybersecurity at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which we will all call CISA. And before that, she was the Assistant Secretary for Cybersecurity and Communications with CISA's predecessor, the National Protection and Programs Directorate. She has an extensive background as advisors to Secretaries of Homeland Security and to the National Security Council, and has a background in military intelligence. Our second guest expert is Rear Admiral retired Mark Montgomery, who is the Executive Director of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission 2.0. He was also Executive Director of Cyberspace Solarium 1.0, which was one of the most important and influential bodies making recommendations to the Congress and the executive branch on how to strengthen and improve cybersecurity. Mark was previously Policy Director for Senate Armed Services Committee, where he worked for the late Senator John McCain. He served 32 years in uniform in the U.S. Navy before retiring as a Rear Admiral in 2017. And then finally, Lauren Zabarek, who is a senior policy advisor for the cybersecurity division at CISA. Previously, she was executive director of the Cyber Project at Harvard University's Belfer Center. Her background is in military intelligence, cybersecurity, policy, and has written extensively on cybersecurity policy and practices from a global perspective. So let me lead off our discussion, Jeanette, with a question to you. As somebody who has worked in senior policy levels at CISA, you've seen obviously the roles not just for domestic cybersecurity activity, but the important role that international cooperation plays in cybersecurity. Indeed, it's Pillar 5 of the new National Cybersecurity Strategy. But a lot of people, I think, if we can take a step back, a lot of people don't really understand the importance of international cooperation in cybersecurity. So can you give us a sense from your government and private sector experience, why is international cybersecurity cooperation so important?
Sure, happy to. And thanks for having me and for allowing me to participate virtually. My son woke up with a fever this morning, and so really appreciate the Atlantic Council's ability to make this happen. As Tom mentioned, most of my career was in the Army and then at Homeland Security working on cybersecurity issues, and now I run risk and compliance for Google Cloud. So I will take kind of both perspectives from my time of what I saw in the government and then also the perspective for a global hyperscaler like Google. And so, for me, I think we've always understood the importance of international cooperation on a variety of security issues. And I think the challenge historically was recognizing the importance for cybersecurity to be considered on par with other security types of cooperation internationally. And as was already said before, so I won't rehash it too much, but the importance of having regional stability and regional cooperation, again, on a variety of security issues is sort of well proven and well thought through. But adding cybersecurity to that ability for regional cooperation and regional stability, it allows us to have much greater sense of being able to reduce international consequences as a result of that regional stability, and in the importance of driving norms of behavior, not just the sharing of IOCs, which is super important and important to build those trust relationships, but sharing and establishing norms of behavior with regional entities, regional cooperation, and being able to scale that out internationally is very important, especially when we come to needs where you have aggressors at a regional level or at a global level, and being able to rely on long-established trusted partnerships at regional and global fora. On the private sector side, it becomes even more important. Something that I've seen is, as at Google, we're investing a lot in the Middle East. I'll highlight that since that's what we've been focused on in that region, and in really investing in building capabilities to bring cloud to the Middle East, which is both sort of a regional investment, but it's also dependent on our global infrastructure. And so being able to serve locally based off of something that is globally secure and scalable is an incredible opportunity to bring digital transformation and frankly security at scale that cannot always be achieved by having just local instances. So I think it also really highlights that really, and I think frankly emerging widely connection between that local and regional sort of computing capability and how that is so connected globally. And so there's both opportunities, of course, and risks, and in activities like the Abraham Accord that is driving that regional cooperation and that regional focus on cybersecurity as a part of a broad effort for regional stability, really, I think, drives home and enables us to take advantage of global capabilities while also scaling our security across the globe.
Admiral Montgomery, the Cyber Solarium report was one of the truly groundbreaking efforts to mobilize and energize the U.S. government to understand how to organize itself better for cybersecurity activity. What advice from the experience that you have, what advice would you have for countries in the Abraham Accords as they think how to structure themselves through their own cybersecurity organization, and especially given the emphasis that you all placed on partnerships between government and the private sector? How would you advise some of these countries to think of the cooperation that they need to engender in their own economies and societies?
Well, first, thanks for having me here today. And yeah, I do think that there are a number of lessons you can learn from our experiences and certainly from our report, but also from the recent released National Cybersecurity Strategy. And I'd say first among them is the idea that they can work together on assessing and resolving cyber resilience issues. Undersecretary Silver's referred to this a little bit, but I mean, we look at it very clearly that there are adversaries that, and there are different adversaries for each of the countries involved in the Abraham Accords, but you know, and for ourselves, there are adversaries that target your military mobility, your ports, your air, your rail systems, but securing them is important to each of these countries. From a United States perspective, we'd like countries that we work with, have forces stationed in, operate with routinely to have secure military mobility. Then there's the national critical infrastructure. I think the Bahrain ambassador addressed this pretty well, but the idea that your financial services systems, your electrical power grid, your water systems, and certainly I'll tell you in water, Iran has made strong, has attacked regional countries' water systems, and I'd say that's one area where in fact, that's one of the best areas or most clear, articulated areas of where we've seen attacks on water systems. We can't really figure out what's happening in the United States there. And then third, disinformation. A lot of these adversaries practice disinformation. It's usually cyber-enabled information operations. So you really have to attack all three of those areas. That's a lot of work. When you can share best practices across them, you can get a lot done. I think many of the countries, I wouldn't say they have a common adversary, but they have adversaries that hit them pretty routinely, whether it's, with the United States, from China and Russia, others from Iran, so you see that. The second area I'd say after that is research and development. We had a strong push on the need for the government to work with the private sector and push basic research and development into the development of these tools. The Israeli ambassador had a great description of their move in this, and even in the United States as well. If of the worldwide startups in cybersecurity software, it's still about 60% plus are in the United States. I'd say between 20 and 30% are in Israel, and many of them recapitalize themselves in the United States. So from those two countries alone, you can get a lot of research and development, best practices and assistance, and I think that would help the other countries. And finally, I'd mention education. The UAE cybersecurity minister brought that up, and he's absolutely right. That is an area where we identified significant vulnerabilities in the United States, where we have not, when you're talking about middle school and high school, kind of giving implanting the basic beliefs in cyber hygiene and the value of a cybersecurity job. We haven't done a great job there, but investing in that, investing in community colleges like his Pulse or vocational schools, and then finally in universities themselves. And you've seen a big push by the U.S. government to try to work on this, either at CISA or at the National Science Foundation. But we still have a lot of work to do to address this nationally. But I think there's a lot we can share there with Abraham Accords signers.
And Lauren, let me turn to you. You've had a unique set of experiences in your policy advising role in academic research and now working at CISA. One of the key roles that we've been discussing here today is the importance of what governments can do to encourage private sector development to make the private sector more resilient and secure. As Undersecretary Silver said, this enhances all of these economic sectors of our society. But I remember how Secretary Mayorkas has been stressing overall the importance of partnerships in all of DHS's mission space. And as Mark's work shows, nowhere is that probably more important than in the cyber domain. So what do you think governments can do to try to encourage private sector cyber cooperation so that governments don't have to do everything? How can governments encourage the private sector to do a better job internationally at this kind of cooperation?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. It's a really big honor to be here. You're right, our partnerships are so critical, not only within the United States, but across the world. And as we've seen, these digital threats, they affect everyone. I think, for a long time, we really thought of defense as, primarily the role of, our traditional defense systems, right? Our military, our Department of Defense, and other institutions. But really, that responsibility, I think, is spread to not only the public sector, but also the private sector. So that is a really big question, is how we get the more capable actors, right, to shoulder some of these burdens. And that's actually one of the fundamental shifts in the cybersecurity strategy, is trying to get these actors to really shoulder those burdens. And so, encouraging where we can the most capable actors to take on some of those burdens, but then also making investments in areas where maybe some of the private sector organizations can't necessarily make those investments, right? So how can governments help make those investments as well? And, I think too, as we look to, how the private sector can partner, asking them to think about how we can actually be more secure by design, right? So, and how can we expect those organizations to build that into their products, their software, et cetera. So, citizens can ask this of governments, but we can also ask this of our private sector organizations too.
Can I jump in on that for a
Yes.
second? I agree completely with everything Lauren said. And I want to acknowledge that our private sector, if you take a case study like Ukraine, our private sector has actually been, along, at the leading edge. If you think pre-event, pre-February 24th, it was compensated at normal rates. But if you think about it, at a minimum, Mandiant, Microsoft, CrowdStrike were in Ukraine, sometimes under USAID contracts, sometimes on their own through relationships they developed. But they had a lot to do with the security of the Ukrainian grid and broader electrical power, particularly electrical power, but in the broader national critical infrastructure. Post the invasion, I think at a much reduced or free rate, and you can think of other critical infrastructure things like Starlink and others that have contributed as well. But those same companies are in there, so there is a public-private partnership on this already. Part of it's fueled by business, but part of it's also fueled by a shared commitment to some national security principles. And so I really think that that's one of the areas where we're in pretty good shape already. And because of the natural, the idea that most of these weapons, most of these systems, defensive systems or even some offensive systems, develop more naturally in the private sector, it stands to reason that they would be on the leading edge. And I think many of them have made great partnerships. And I see that across all the kind of big cybersecurity software companies.
Jeanette, let me turn to you and try to think about turning back some of the stereotypes that exist about what international cooperation in the cyber domain looks like. I mean, normally when you talk about international cooperation, you conjure up images in the Middle East of people, sitting around tables sipping tea and eating cookies. But then when you add the word cybersecurity in front of it, all of a sudden the image switches to a bunch of people at screens in a windowless room somewhere underground with harsh lighting and things like this. Those of us who've actually been practitioners in this domain understand that those are both stereotypes. Give us a sense of what international cybersecurity cooperation really looks like. How does it really work?
That's a great question, and those two stereotypes are very true. I've spent a lot of time broad international cooperation, also in the Middle East, and for sure, I've not been a part of either of those scenarios, though I have had my fair share of windowless rooms, I guess. So I would say the cooperation, it has to, in order for it to be successful, in the times that it's been successful, it has to be focused on a specific goal. And so whether that is providing aid in crisis situations, right, that is a very different set of activities and cooperation and organizations, frankly, that are going to be working together. Or it's just building up better cyber capabilities, a better cyber ecosystem in a region that is a different set of activities. Now, I think the one thing that is true across the board is and again, even outside of cyber cooperation, is understanding what the overall goal is for the team that's trying to cooperate, but also establishing trust. And you can't really do that in the moment of the crisis or in the moment of the ultimate need. So it's kind of bringing it back to the Abraham Accords and other work that is doing that to try to establish these agreements, these boundaries, these norms of how organizations and governments and private sector are going to work together. It's really important, and it's really important to practice that. It's important that both sides are delivering value, but in the end, it's really important that you have a shared outcome and that it's specific enough that people can action that.
Well, and Lauren, let me turn to you to follow up on that, because the issue of trust is one of the things that a diplomatic initiative like the Abraham Accords extending to cybersecurity can help promote. Can you give us a sense of the importance of trust, especially in the cyber domain and especially internationally?
Yeah, something that Jeanette, was talking about, and I really want to pull on this, is this, topic of resilience, and especially, from the trust and cooperation here. I think a lot of us think about sort of left of boom and securing our systems and things like that, which is incredibly important. This is something that we need to do as well. But we also need to think about that right of boom situation, right? So what happens when the breach or the attack actually happens, right? God forbid. But as we do kind of live in an age where things do happen, we need to be prepared. So I think the more that we can work together to prepare for those situations, and have sort of a common set of understandings and procedures and policies for when that happens, then I think the recovery from those events will actually be a lot more smoother and quicker. And as we know, when we're talking about cybersecurity, especially of our critical infrastructure, we're talking about livelihoods, we're talking about safety and well-being, in addition to economic security, energy security, and things like that. So the trust there is really important, not only from a macro level, but on that micro level of working together. Hey, what are you going to do in this situation? What will be our role? How will we communicate? So a lot of really important things there.
Hey, can I pick up on trust for 1 second? So I agree with this. And when I think about, cybersecurity is kind of unique in, and when we think about partner capacity building, it's a lot of things you can do. Like if two countries are buying a THAAD weapon system or a Patriot weapon system, in theory, language is allowing they could train together, and there's nothing to prevent that. It doesn't happen that often, but it can happen. In cybersecurity, that can't happen. It can't happen because it takes all your trust to just allow that one country to kind of work with you on your securing your systems, because once you start to do that kind of work, you reveal a lot of vulnerabilities, and there's a level of trust that has to be there. And so one of the things that's unique, I think the Accords provides a framework in which you can do a series of bipartisan, or bilateral capacity building events that I think are important, and then they can build into exercises. But even then, when you watch a cybersecurity exercise done at the multilateral level, it ends up being the country of orange, has done this to the alleged state of red, and it's not, and you lose a lot there because look, we know a lot. We understand what kind of end day, patched and unpatched end day vulnerabilities are used by the Iranians or by the Chinese or by the Russians, and so we can help each other, but to help each other, you really have to have trust. Because at the core level, cybersecurity, this, and I'm talking here about, particularly in the defense and intelligence realms, is about revealing, requires you to reveal some level of vulnerability, and that really takes a lot. But I like this, and you've seen that, and you're starting to see the United States work very explicitly and discreetly with certain vulnerable allies and partners to ensure they have this.
Mm-hmm. Jeanette, let me talk about the role of public-private cooperation in fighting cybercrime. I mean, we heard Representative Slacken describe in the United States the extent of ransomware is such that school superintendents in her district in Michigan are commonly facing this kind of a challenge. What kind of things are governments able to do with the private sector in terms of fighting cybercrime, and how does an approach like multilateral cooperation enable those efforts to protect our publics from these criminals? How does that work?
That's a big question. I think maybe to take the last part, the multilateral first, and there's been a lot of good work here, but the multilateral cooperation on cybercrime is potentially one of the most important things that we could be doing, because these criminals are able to take advantage of various different jurisdictions and various, we'll call them holes in our cooperative agreements and extradition, et cetera, to hide and to escape consequences. So I think improving the ability to have those processes go faster between law enforcement entities, between organizations like Interpol, Europol, et cetera. I think that's really, really important to streamline those processes. You want to ensure, of course, that you have all of the appropriate protections in place. But I think the lack of consequences for many criminals is a challenge that governments can work hard on. Now, on the private sector side, I think there's two main things that are not particularly profound, but I'll say them anyway. One is we need to be continuing to develop better software, better systems that can prevent these sorts of exploits happening. And I think government in the US and other governments are doing a good job of driving things like software supply chain transparency and ensuring better practices, being better consumers of software, being smarter consumers of software, I think is really important. So just sort of generally, we need to up-level the security and resilient capabilities of our software. And then I think, the other areas, of course, continuing to provide evidence when that makes sense to our government partners so that they can build those cases.
Well, and Lauren, let me ask you to elaborate on that, and in particular, as you think about how we might be able to offer advice to the high-tech companies of these dynamic Middle Eastern economies, because as Jeanette has said, as Mark has said, one of the key points of the new cybersecurity strategy that you all just released is trying to get companies, as Google has been a responsible actor, and there have been other responsible actors, but we now need to spread this idea, this ability of those who produce cyber or any kind of cyber tools, software platforms, to understand that their responsibility really does start with security, not just features and functions. So what is it that you would like to be recommending to these dynamic companies in the region that they need to do to better secure their customers?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the initiatives that you're kind of referring to here is our Secure by Design initiative, and that was really talked about in the National Cybersecurity Strategy released by the Office of the National Cyber Director. And this is something that we're working on very diligently at CISA to, we just put out a white paper talking about the principles, and that built on the Foreign Affairs article by CISA Director Jen Easterly and EAD Goldstein, who runs the cybersecurity division, really putting a stake in the ground saying, yes, software companies, right, you do have a responsibility to build your software securely, because you're right, we have this entire ecosystem, right, where actors, whether nation state or criminals, can exploit those systems. But if we actually take a step back and kind of looked at the environment very holistically, we can see that, well, if our software was a lot more secure, then we would have less of an ability to actually exploit that. So one particular example is the use of memory-safe languages. And there's a statistic, and I'm not going to remember off the top of my head, but the use of memory-safe languages.
Explain to some people in the audience what
Sure.
a memory-safe language is.
So in developing software and coding, right, there are a number of languages that different developers use. And so there's some that actually are not keeping those memory caches safe and secure, and then there's others that do. And so we are trying to push the use of those particular languages to make those, the software more secure. And then that would actually eliminate a number of vulnerabilities, because a lot of the vulnerabilities actually, stem from that particular issue. So, so encouraging companies to do that. There's also a lot of really great best practices. I mean, Google, has talked a lot about them, through standardization, with software development. So there's a lot of things on the micro level that we can be sharing with companies, across the accords, on best practices to develop software securely, but also, from, again, that macro level, the agreements, right? Also people, starting to say, hey, we actually want this, right? This is something that we should expect from companies, as well as countries and their governments, wanting to expect that as well, and using their purchasing power too.
Excellent. Let me remind everyone that we're going to be taking questions from the audience, please using the QR codes for those of you here, and using the Ask AC website for those of you online. So we'll be taking questions. Mark, one of the things that happens when you have governmental initiatives like the Abraham Accords is that it sends a green light to the private sector that there's an official blessing for your activities in this area, and in particular the kinds of direct exchanges, business to business, company to company. Can you give us any insights from your experience of how governmental green lights can drive innovation in the private sector and the kinds of broader cooperation that certainly governments and end users like us would all like to see these companies doing in cybersecurity?
Yep. So two thoughts. First, I do want to pick up on the last two thoughts from Jeanette and Lauren, and they were about the advice we can give our the Abraham Accords partners, and the one I would mention is that you really there is a useful kind of aggressive move to the use of cloud service providers and managed service providers. I just think while we have this this kind of broadly recognized cybersecurity workforce shortfall, it's not realistic to expect that particularly medium-sized businesses, especially ones that have a high density of funds and a low workforce level, and that describes a lot of the companies in the region, they need to find a secure environment. Now, I would also couple that. I think I'm required anytime I'm with someone from Google, Microsoft, or Amazon to say that it ought to be required, alongside the United States pushing a high level of a minimum standard of cybersecurity in those clouds. And I think if I was a country taking this in, I would, and I don't have a pathological fear of the word regulation like we have in the United States, that I'd say regulate yourself a high level of cybersecurity in those cloud service providers in the cloud computing industry. So that's the first thing I'd say. The second is, a green light, what I think it is it's saying that, we're not, we expect, I think most of these cybersecurity companies were moving in there anyway. Like when I look at Taiwan right now, we're giving every possible green light in the world. But when you go there, you find that, Google's been there for, a decade since they left, China behind, and have done great work working on the critical infrastructure, building, and putting some of their own infrastructure there. So, I mean, and they're not the only company, there's many others like that. So when you go around, there's a strong signal. I think it's more a signal about Israeli cybersecurity companies coming into those countries, and that's where I think more the green light is, because I think our companies are global and ubiquitous. I mean, I don't like to see them in China, Russia, Iran, or North Korea for very obvious reasons, but outside of that, and for their own purposes, they've left Russia, Iran, and North Korea anyway. Really, we're just talking about China with a handful of these companies, and I think it puts us at great risk when they operate there. But for the green light, I think the green light's really about, in this case, the Israeli companies. And I have to tell you, as Ambassador Herzog said, 20 to 25% of the cybersecurity startups worldwide, and some of the very best ones, you recognize them today and think they're a U.S. company, but in reality, their birth was in Israel and in the kind of like very accommodating, ecosystem they've built there between academia, the really former military and intelligence officials, and funding that has really allowed great growth.
Okay. Let me turn to a couple of interesting audience questions. One from Razan asks, what potential benefits or challenges might there be for other countries, either that are in the Abraham Accords but haven't yet signed up to the cybersecurity initiative, or other countries, and obviously Saudi Arabia is at the top of everyone's list of countries. Will they join the Abraham Accords? Cybersecurity may not be their first thought in that direction, but it certainly is something. Jeanette, what would be your thought in terms of the benefits that would accrue to other countries trying to join in this kind of a multilateral collaboration environment that is created by these accords? What are the benefits of other countries coming into a process like this?
Well, I'll comment just on the cybersecurity collaboration, not maybe the geopolitics. Every country in the region has to consider their own requirements there. But as I talked about in the beginning, the importance of having regional stability based off of known agreements of behavior, the frameworks to share, to build capacity, I think it is really important, and it will improve the lives of all the participants. And so to the extent that other countries, and we work with the Saudi Arabians, we work with a lot of different countries in the region. They all take cybersecurity quite seriously, and so I know that this is an important area for them. And so to the extent that we can help these different countries who haven't signed up understand the importance both for them regionally and the benefit that they'll obtain, as well as the global impact that regional stability can have. I think it's important. But again, I understand every country has different things that they need to consider, and this is oftentimes bigger than just cybersecurity.
Mm-hmm. Hey, can I pick up on that? So first, I fully think cybersecurity is one of the best areas for Saudi Arabia to think about as they in the Biden administration reset our relationship and consider joining something like this. I'll tell you right now, the alternative to the United States and Israel when it comes to cybersecurity products is China. And China is pathological in the insertion of cyber malicious activity intellectual property theft. They cannot help themselves. When they assisted the African Union in building their IT and cyber network at their headquarters, 6 to 12 months later, the African Union realized that basically every transmission inside their building was being sent overnight back to China. They have 2 significant national laws, an intelligence law and a counterintelligence law, that very explicitly require their companies to provide, and I think this is going to start to impact U.S. companies who continue to operate there as well, but that they have to provide an unreasonable amount of information to the government at their demand. If your choice is between working with Chinese IT and cybersecurity and IT and information technology, the telecommunications equipment, or U.S. and Israeli, one of them is going to leave you a lot more secure, a lot less vulnerable, and is really your long-term solution. So for that regard, I think cybersecurity is an important aspect of the broader challenge facing Saudi Arabia, questions facing Saudi Arabia over the next 6 to 12 months.
And I want to acknowledge Jonathan Lord, our friend and colleague at the Center for New American Security. Mark has just answered your question, so if you missed it, please go back and replay that on the replay, because you precisely anticipated Jonathan's excellent question. Lauren, for the last question, as somebody who has thought deeply about the evolution of cybersecurity and how it needs to develop and mature in the directions that we've been discussing, I'd like you to sort of bring together the how cybersecurity will evolve part with how this will affect the economies and societies in the Middle East. And in particular, a number of the broad trends that we have been discussing in terms of companies building security by design, in terms of the need for trust and the need for cooperation at network speed. How do you think that's going to affect the digital economies of these vibrant Middle Eastern countries that we're talking about? What is the future direction going to be that would help these countries better secure their online domains?
Yeah, and really pulling the thread to that Mark just said, opening now these markets to Israeli, cybersecurity firms too, and it just creates a bigger market to choose from and more secure products there. So that goes to the economics as well. Just, the more people-to-people and business-to-business exchange, that's always, I think, a very positive aspect of this cooperation. But ultimately, when I think about this, it's all about people, right? At the end of the day, that's what we're trying to not only secure, not only trying to ensure that are safe, and their well-being is secured as well, but from an economic perspective, right? Investing in the region, ensuring that education and healthcare are protected. I mean, those 2 areas were really hit from a cybercrime perspective during the pandemic. Energy security, right? So we talk about all these things sort of, our critical infrastructure, but at the end of the day, it's all about people. And so as I look towards the evolution of cybersecurity and these agreements and trust and cooperation between people, and as Jeanette was saying too, the regional stability, that's what I look toward, is how all of the people in these countries will be safer and more secure, and really able to further their livelihoods in the region.
Well, thank you very much, Lauren. I want to thank our expert panelists today for their enormously insightful contributions. Jeanette Manfra, Global Director for Security and Compliance at Google. Rear Admiral retired Mark Montgomery of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission 2.0. Lauren Zabarek, Senior Policy Advisor for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agencies. Thank you to our participants, to our honored guests, Undersecretary Rob Silvers of the Department of Homeland Security, Ambassadors Herzog and Al Khalifa, and I want to say also a special thank you. The N7 initiative is a partnership between the Atlantic Council and the Jeffrey M. Talpins Foundation. We are very grateful for their support. Thanks also to the leaders of our In7 initiative, Ambassador Dan Shapiro, and to Mariah Smith and Yulia Shalamov, and to Clark Cooper for leading off this discussion. So thank you very much for joining us today. We're very grateful for your interest, for your attention in what clearly promises to be an expanding area of international cooperation and international cybersecurity. Thank you very much.